Welcome in, everybody. So, this is a fun video about the Johnny Manziel documentary on Netflix. So, I'm just going to talk about that a little bit, maybe from a coach's perspective. And I spoke to a friend of mine, Ross Gusky, who used to coach Division One baseball, and we had a back and forth about this, and I thought it was pretty good. So, I just want to share some points that we discussed about that and some takeaways. So, one of the big questions I had initially watching the doc is if you were a coach, how would you respond to a player like Johnny Manziel? So in the documentary, they don't really give Johnny Manziel any relevant consequences. And part of me always wonders, is there a way to redirect that behavior so there's not such a bad outcome? And when I was talking to a couple of different people about it, we discussed options like suspending him for a certain number of games, cutting him from the team. Also talked about that. But one of my big things watching the entire thing all the way through is if you were the coach in that circumstance, or even if you were the offensive coordinator, Cliff Kingsbury, if you attempted to give Johnny Manziel a relevant consequence to try and deter that type of behavior, would the university go for it? So would the athletic director, would the president, would they allow you to suspend that player because Johnny Manziel was bringing 100,000 people into the stadium in College Station, making a lot of money for a lot of different people? So I'm wondering if they would have let the coaching staff discipline Johnny Manziel appropriately. So that was one of my big things looking at that, because it seems like the way they make it look in the documentary is Johnny Manziel never really got a relevant consequence from anybody, whether it be his parents, whether it be the college, whether it be the Cleveland Browns. So that was a pretty interesting perspective. And I was just wondering if I was a coach, how I would handle that. And I didn't even know Johnny Manziel was redshirted initially at Texas A&M. So he actually sat out 1 year, his true freshman year, and then only played 2 years after that. So I thought that was an interesting point, an interesting thing to talk about. How would you approach that situation if you get a player like that? And then the discussion turned to something very intriguing to me. So my friend brought this up, Ross Gusky. He is a big proponent of trying to get athletes to pursue other things than their chosen sport. So, for example, right, he made a great point about Johnny Manziel and whether or not anybody had the conversation with him. Maybe football isn't the best thing for you to be doing, considering what types of behaviors it led to, considering the inevitable outcome, considering the spiral that it took every time he engaged in that activity. So just because you're good at something, does that mean you should pursue it? Especially if that thing leads you to other questionable behaviors. So, for instance, right, if somebody like asked Johnny Manziel or just told Johnny Manziel from a very early age, like, look, you might be good at football, but football is not your only option. You can do a whole bunch of other things. But it seems like in the documentary, from a very young age, and he mentions this, if you don't play football, you're ostracized. And if you do play football, you're great. It's fantastic. And it seemed like a very black and white dichotomy there. And imagine what that does to a person if you don't play football, or if you don't really like football and you feel like you have to play it. So just because you're good at something, I think this is very important for coaches today to realize, most of their players, the vast majority of them, aren't going to play in college and aren't going to play professional. And even if they do make it to college or the professional ranks, they're not going to be the top tier in those organizations or professions. So it's okay to have other hobbies. It's okay to do other things, because even if you're a good athlete or you're good at a particular sport, chances are you're not going to be able to make a living off of it. And there might be some detrimental side effects to you participating in that sport. Like Johnny Manziel, for instance, seemed to develop a drinking problem early on in life that revolved around football, and then substance abuse issues that revolved around football. And And I'm not going to assume too much about him, but it sounded like he did those things because he didn't like football or didn't want to continue pursuing football. But if you're a really good football player and that's all you've been doing and you decide you don't like it and you haven't really been doing anything else your entire life, it's pretty depressing when you finally stop doing that thing or you come to the realization that you might have to stop doing that thing because you're not good enough to continue. So to sum all of that up, it's okay for athletes to pursue other things, and it's okay for them to stop doing a sport, even if they're good at it, if doing that sport has unintended negative consequences. So I think that's one of the big takeaways. And this was a great point that my friend made, Ross. And we recorded that conversation, but for whatever reason, I couldn't get it on here. So I wanted to voice his opinion. It was a great opinion, I thought. And then I think the last point I want to make, and we discussed this a little bit at length, is as a parent, this is from a different lens now, as a parent, when should you intervene when you see your child making bad decisions that lead to bad outcomes? So repeatedly throughout the doc, his parents would make comments like, well, we tried to help Johnny Manziel, but at some point we were just like, he needs to go do whatever he's doing, and we're just going to leave that up to him. And then he inevitably spiraled out of control and came close to killing himself. So something I struggle with in general is when to intervene and when to let people figure things out on their own. Because when I was watching it, I was like, why aren't these parents doing more to deter undesirable behavior? And then the more people I talked to, the more they were like, well, at some point you have to let a grown man be a grown man, a grown woman be a grown woman. You have to let them make decisions and figure it out and make mistakes on their own. So I think that's a really hard balance to strike. Because if I was Johnny Manziel's father and I saw all of these drinking issues that he developed while he was in college, and it sounded like he developed them in high school too, I feel like you need like a heavy intervention early on to prevent that from getting worse, which it inevitably did. But his dad, I think in the doc made a good point, like, hey, I've tried to help you repeatedly. If you don't want my help at some point, I just have to let you go, which is kind of hard for me to wrap my head around as a parent. But it's something worth thinking about because you might find yourself in that situation one day. So all very good things that come from the documentary, and I definitely recommend giving it a watch and just thinking about how you would approach somebody that's in a situation like Johnny Manziel, how you would assist them. There's a whole bunch of other things I could talk about in regards to the NCAA and making money and various things, but I want to keep this video short. Just look at it through a coaching lens and a parenting lens. Thank you. Subscribe, like, and as always, if you want to debate anything I talk about on my channel, come see me.